Hello, class. This is your professor, Dr. Brian Lippincott, and we are moving on from Vygotsky and the contextualist and his understanding of language. And I'm going to answer a quick question, which I think is very interesting, and I think you'll all like to hear about the use of cognitive behavioral therapy when a child is behind on egocentric speech, which means that you can't really use the cognitive part of CBT. You have to use the behavioral part. So I'm going to answer that question quickly, and then we're going to move on to part B of Vygotsky, where we're going to talk about how colors and how different cultures see colors differently and what that says about contextualism and the social aspect of language and how that impacts our thinking, and Vygotsky and other people's theories about language development in children.
Vygotsky and his thing. Any comments or questions, anything anybody has about that? If not, I'm going to move on to language development next, which ties in with all these things.
I have a question. I guess I'm curious, how do you help somebody who doesn't have egocentric speech develop?
Well, really quickly, because I hate it when people say, oh, I'm going to answer that. But CBT, you go for the B. You see what I'm saying? You don't go for the C because the cognitive part has a lot to do with you have to have self-talk and egocentric speech, right? But behavioral change, you don't. So for instance, I had a kid I might have told you about before that refused to drink water at school because he thought all the water at school was poison. So his conviction with this delusion was, Sam, how sure are you that 100% sure? So there was no use using any cognitive, wow, well, what is the evidence? Let me examine it. No, it would have caused this big argument, right? But behaviorally, it's like, oh, well, you're not going to school. So don't worry about the water. How can you still go to school and not drink water? Can we bring water from home? Can we get a water purification? What can you just go for at least a couple hours till you get thirsty? We figured out all these ways. And then once the kid goes to school and behaviorally experiences that, then you can shift and start talking about the cognitions. So you don't use the cognitive part, you focus purely behaviorally, or you might use something like expressive arts. A lot of people can express what they're experiencing in their home life, for instance, by the kinetic family drawing. Draw me a picture of your but they might not be able to tell you in words. And if you're going to work with that, you might somebody draws me a picture of a really disruptive scene in their family, and I use a Jungian technique. And I'm going to put a golden circle around this to contain it so it can't bother you. You see how I'm using an image? I'm not using speech. I'm using the image in artwork to do that. Those are two. That's a great question. That was.
Yes.
Yeah, so I can go off and start talking about things. But yes, that's a really good question. But the simple thing is you go for a behavioral change first. And then once the person makes the behavioral change and you start, and also one of the main benefits of children that go to therapy, young children from like 3 to 12 that go to therapy, one of the main benefits is it increases their language for discussing emotions. So just the idea of going to therapy is going to kind of start to kick in, and talking about what's going on in their lives and how they feel about is going to start to kick in this egocentric speech, and you can start saying, well, what are you saying inside of your house? Or do you have a picture in your mind? Now let's describe this picture, and they might say, I see red. There's a famous technique, expressive art technique called Color My World, which was created by a woman named Violet Oaklander a long time ago. But and color, what we know from Jung has all this color symbolism, but we know that if you draw me a picture of your world and you have a variety of different colors, I can start to say, oh, wow, you drew the teacher who suspended you in black. What does black mean? So black might mean, for instance, many times, some people in the Rorschach really notice color and some don't. But sometimes culturally, people from the Middle East see black as a positive thing, where maybe some other cultures might see black as a negative thing. So you have to take that into account. But once you figure out what green means, green doesn't, I believe, mean, oh, it's envy. But it could mean that, but it could mean a lot of different things. But once you figure out the meaning of a certain color to a certain person, it stays that way. And you're developing through color in art, you're developing those linguistic skills that later they can turn into words. So it can be complicated to do, but if knowing that somebody has a weakness in egocentric speech or in self-talk is a good place to start, and starting to use other techniques like art or behavioral stimulus and response type of thing. Okay. Language development. So this here, a picture of Noam Chomsky in his younger years, not now. So when it comes to language and several things, the first approach is the nativist approach. The nativist approach attributes language acquisition to biological mechanisms and stresses universal patterns of language development. Chomsky, who was talked about in our chapter or our reading for today, was the major advocate of this position, proposes that an innate language acquisition device, LAD, makes it possible for a person to acquire language just by being exposed to it. Support for this proposal come from studies of children, that children universally master the basics of language between 4 and 6, regardless of the complexity of their native language, and that children from all cultures pass through the same stages of language development, which we'll talk about briefly. Even among deaf children, the development of sign language parallels the development of speech. So it's the nativist believes that there's a critical period, and that if you miss it, it's really hard, which is why I have been trying for the last 25 years to learn, but I didn't learn Spanish as a kid, so it's really hard to learn a different language now. For me, especially at my age now, than it would be if I was 4 or 6. I would learn it much easily, which is why, for instance, in dealing with that, it's very common in certain cultural milieus for the 16-year-old oldest daughter in the family to do all the translating for the parents because they can learn language much more easily. Much of the understanding of critical periods comes from the work of ethologists like Conrad Lorenz, who found the critical period for imprinting occurs in the first 2 or 3 days after. He's the one with the ducks that has ducks all chasing them around. Oh, there it is. So the concept of critical periods is not only important to theories of language acquisition, but also underlies a number of other theories, includes Freud developmental theory of psychosexual development and Erickson's psychosocial theory. So critical periods are important. So let's see here. This is the interactionist approach, which is different than the natives. Interactions regarding language development are the result of a combination of biological and environmental factors. The social communication version of this approach stresses the impact of social interaction, which would lean more toward Vygotsky, right? For instance, adults, at least white middle-class adults in westernized society, seem to naturally use motherese. And I believe recently, in the last 10, 15 years, they've seen other cultures use that in their own language too. When speaking to very young children, that is, they speak more slowly, use shorter sentences, exaggerate and repeat the most important words, and emphasize the here and now. In addition, adults often respond to children's communication with an expansion. An expansion is, the child says, me go. The parent is likely to respond with something like, yes, you're going with me to the stores. That's an expansion. You see how that's motherese? That's an interaction between the environment. As the child learns more language, we start then the adults learn to do that. And so you can look at this, but there's phenomena, all the morphology, syntax, all the different things, and we learn that as we go on. And Chomsky talked about distinguishing surface structures from deep structures. The surface structure is the words I say. For instance, I might say, visiting relatives can be tiresome. Now, a deep structure might be, when I go visiting relatives, it's tiresome because I have to leave my own environment and all this and that. Or it might mean when relatives come visit me, they are tiresome. You see, there could be two deep structures for one surface structure. Sentences with different surface structures can also have identical deep structures. I have no money and I don't have any money at all are essentially the same meaning. According to Chomsky's transformational grammar, speaking involves transforming deep structure, meaning, so when you speak, I'm taking my deep structure, I'm turning that into a surface structure and saying words. According to Chomsky's notion of transformational grammar, speaking involves transforming deep structure, meaning, into surface structure. So that's how you create a sentence. Listening is taking the surface structure that's said to you and interpret. So you see how miscommunication can be a problem because my deep structure might be different than that. The surface structure can be ambiguous. The deep structure has a certain meaning and it could mean two different things or more. So these are all the stages: crying, cooing, babbling, elation, which is imperfect imitation. And it goes blah, 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 but it's imagining the intonation of language in that particular language. Alien, expressive jargon, holophrasic speech, holoprastic speech. From 1 or 2 years of age, children use one word to express whole sentences, like the word, I'm eating a pancake, and I dropped the pancake. Pancake, pancake. And then my mom picks it up and gives me a piece. Oh, pancake. I'm saying the word pancake over and over, but I'm meaning a lot of different things by it. This tastes good, that kind of thing. Factors. Early studies, like gender. What are the factors? Early studies comparing language acquisition of boys and girls found that girls speak earlier, articulate better, and have fewer speech defects. Well, these differences were first attributed to biological factors. Subsequent studies suggest that they are more likely due to social and cultural influences. For instance, experiment is done. You have a baby and a mom sitting in a park, and the baby is dressing on a green blanket. The first question that people ask, is it a boy or a girl? Now, if the parent says boy, they're going to take the boy, they're going to probably hold him face out. In the United States, they're going to throw him up significantly more and do these kind of things like vroom, vroom, vroom. If you say it's a girl, they're probably going to hold that baby. I want you to see what I'm doing. If you say it's a girl, they're probably going to hold the baby like this, stare at its face and say, oh, honey, you're so beautiful. So there's a lot of evidence that that may be the cause of girls speaking earlier as our preconceived ideas. Okay. Let me see if there's anything else to share about this. Well, yeah, because I want to talk a little bit about bilingualism. Prior to the 1960s, the results of many research studies suggested that bilingualism, being bilingual, leads to cognitive defects. Wrong. But better controlled studies indicate that bilingual children actually do as well or better even than monolingual children on measures of both cognitive and language development. There remains some question about the effect of bilingualism on the acquisition of vocabulary. So the vocabulary might be slower because you're learning two languages. Although some researchers have concluded that the slower rate of word acquisition by bilingual children is temporary and is normally overcome by the child enters school. So bilingual, and you know two languages. Okay. So any comments on that, questions or ideas or feedback or anything? Because I'm going as fast as I can. Okay. Color terms and color processing. Why are we going into this? Well, That's because it really has a lot to do with what we were just talking about in language development. Now, color terms and color processing. There's what's called the safer Whorf hypothesis, is that culture drives language acquisition. So, for example, the color names in classical Greek did not distinguish between blue and black. Does that mean that somebody who spoke only classical Greek would have trouble distinguishing blue and black perceptually? A few early studies showed that colors easier to describe and remember varied by language. Like in English, I think it's, I don't know, I'm colorblind, but there's a word, chartreuse, I think it is, which is a word that we have. But but there's a certain color, for instance, of a fox that is kind of brownish red, but we don't have a particular color for it. But there are fox hunters or cultures that really do a lot of fox hunting that have a color for that particular color, and we don't. So it doesn't mean we can't see the color. It means that we have to take more words to describe it, so it's easier to describe. Actually, the use of color terms to test Whorf's idea is much more complicated than it appears to be. And I'm not talking about the Klingon Whorf, I'm talking about Whorf was a linguist. Also, different cultures, there is a surprising regularity in which colors are given distinct names. For instance, Berlin and Kay in 1969 found that there are 11 specific colors which all languages get their basic color names. More interesting was their discovery that languages follow a hierarchy in assigning names to particular colors. There are a few languages that only have two color terms. Inevitably, if you only have two, they're black and white. In any language that has three colors, the names corresponding to black, white, and red. So red is ripe fruit or berries that might be poison. Red is what the next one is. And in languages that have additional basic color terms, these terms are added in the order of the following groups: yellow, blue, green, and brown, then purple, pink, orange, gray. Thus, any language with 5 basic color names will have words which will correspond to white, black, red, and 2 colors from the yellow, blue, green grouping. In contrast to Whorf ideas, these data suggest that there are universal physiological principles behind color naming. Moreover, the notion that names determine color perception received a serious blow in a classic study by Hyder. Okay. Hyder studied the Dani tribe in New Guinea the Dani tribe have 2 color terms. First, she presented colored chips. Then a short time later, she asked each person to try to recognize which of the 2 chips was presented previously. The chips were either a focal color, like red on a stop sign is a focal red, okay, in the center of the spectrum, the shade that most people judge to be the most typical red. Or it was a non-focal color. It's still in the red spectrum of light, but it's an off shade. It's either like a light, darker light. It's a little bit to one side or the other of red. Even though the Dani have only 2 color names, they not only recognize focal colors better than non-focal colors, just as we do, but they could also distinguish between colors that were not represented by different words in their language. So they could tell, which makes sense. Their eyes are the same, but it really was a philosophical thing about language. The research by Herder in Berlin and Kay, along with questions about the accuracy of linguistic antidotes offered by Whorf, led to the general impression that the extent of linguistic determinism was testable. It has been completely refuted. So linguistic determinism, that's like people in different languages actually see the world differently and think differently, which still has some idea to think about. But more recently, however, several investigators have claimed that reports of the death of linguistic determination has been greatly exaggerated. That's what we're going to get into word length and word frequency in a second. These authors point out that Hyder's data were not the crucial test of linguistic determinism that many have taken it to be. Rather, the data like Heider show that it is the strongest version of linguistic determination is not supported. People can distinguish between hues that are not given separate words. So now we know the ability to perceive color is relatively independent from cultural naming practices and language. So language doesn't determine our color perception. But what about less extreme versions of the hypothesis? Do naming practices influence how easily we can distinguish or remember culture? So we're going to move on here. So listed below are 20 words chosen at random from Thorndike and norms of frequency of occurrence in the English language. Besides, each word is a number indicating how many times the word was used in a 1,000,000-word sample of written English. So hunter was used 46 times, devastate 5 times, rag 5 times, midway 7 times. So it goes on and on and on. Win, 100 more times. Very short word. Car, save, result, shorter. A systematic study of the relationship was conducted by Ziff, who examined examples of Latin, Chinese, and English. All 3 languages were found that there was a tendency for the most frequent words to be shorter words. Makes cognitive load sense, less cognitive load. Also known as Ziff's law. The data was plotted to show the same general relationship. Of course, I could have cheated and fixed the data, so I suggest that you get samples of your own. But it's true that we use shorter words more often. So at the heart of this is the idea of codability. Codability refers to how easily a concept can be described in the language. Like the word that I mentioned before, simpático or simpática in Spanish. Now I can, in English, say that's when you really have this deep connection with somebody and you're relating to them on this deep level and you feel like you understand each other. You know, it takes me a whole paragraph to say what they say in one. So it's that simpático is much more codable, and English is, codability comes into play and a consideration of how difficult it is to describe a particular color. For example, if asked to describe the color of a stop sign, you would say red. But what color is a fox? It's kind of a brownish red. Consistent with a weaker version of the safer Whorf hypothesis is the fact that more easily coded colors are better remembered. In addition, comparative judgments among colors may be affected by color naming practices. So there is an interaction between culture and language in how things are. 2 sets of participants, this is the Tarahumara people, who are great runners, actually. 2 sets of participants were involved in the experiment. English speakers and speakers of Tarahumara, a Mexican Indian language that does not have separate terms for blue and green. Kay and Kimpton created some trials in which most English speakers would label chip A as a shade of green and chip B as a grade of blue, even though the 2 chips were relatively close in color. According to the spectrum, they were closer than the third one. That is, they were close in terms of wavelength of light refracted. Chip C was a focal example of green, but it is actually farther away in wavelength from chip A than was chip B. So, okay, you get that. If people are judging such stimuli based on physical characteristic alone, they should pick the 2 chips that are most similar in terms of wavelength, A and B. The Tarahumara speakers did just that. However, English speakers were affected by their color naming practices. They selected as more similar the 2 chips that were both labeled green, even though those chips were farther apart in wavelength of reflected light. Thus, the English speakers evaluated the colors more in terms of the categories in which they were easily coded, where the Tarahumara speakers evaluated the colors more in terms of their continuous physical dimension, where they were on the spectrum. So language does have an impact on our thinking. It makes it easier to think certain things than other things. And for instance, English speakers, we kind of have a weakness compared to a lot of Romance language and other language when it comes to feeling words. We're kind of weak on feeling words. Okay. Any comments about that? Any comments or anything? I want to take a beat here for you all to ask any. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Sabina Spielrein.
And I'll answer every comment, or you can go ahead and ask questions now. And we'll continue on with another subject, which has to do with early psychoanalysis, Freud and Jung, and a woman named Sabina Spielrein, which is in the section of your book that has to do with Russian psychologists, but there's a whole story behind that. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to stop now.